Bem, passemos agora às perguntas. Nós vamos proceder. Ok. Vou recolher. We're going to collect three questions at a time, and then you answer to them, and we go forward until, let's say, a 4:45. Is that okay for you? Okay. So please identify yourself before speaking.
Charles Putz from Verena Ventures.
Louder, please.
Yes. Hello? Okay. Charles Putz from Verena Ventures. My question is how to foam the runaway for Greece. You mentioned that you would have to foam the runaway. Question is how?
Right. Another question.
Marcos Carreira, BMF Bovespa. How would Brazil be a provider of liquidity if Brazil's government is pulling away from allowing people to invest freely, and in general the currency wars may lead to a decrease of global liquidity?
Last one of the first round. One, maybe, second round.
Maria Clara, I'd like to know if the devaluation of the euro would be a solution in the short run. If the devaluation of the euro would be a solution for the problems, in the short run.
Am I on?
Yeah.
So let me take the one about Brazil as a provider of liquidity, global liquidity first, because the other two kind of go together. Having an open capital account and freely providing your currency to foreign banks and firms and governments when they need it in a liquidity crunch requires that you have an open capital account, no doubt about it. So the question is, do we think that the recent taxes and controls on capital inflows that have been added are going to be a permanent feature of the Brazilian economy, and will they be in place 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now? I raise it as a question. I don't know enough about the political economy of Brazil's controls to be able to predict that far out, but the idea that they're now going to be a permanent feature of the Brazilian economy seems to me needs to be shown. Unclear. I know enough, I can recall enough Brazilian history to know that these things have gone through repeated cycles over time, and there could be more cycles in the future as Brazil is bigger relative to the world economy, and its financial markets are deeper and more stable. Maybe the dislocations caused by capital inflows become somewhat less and the need for controls recedes. But there are other people in this room better placed to make that kind of forecast than I am. Marty Feldstein had an article in the Financial Times yesterday or today arguing that devaluation of the euro would be necessary and sufficient. His language was a little bit ambiguous, but he certainly said necessary, and I also think he argued sufficient. It would be enough to solve the euro crisis or get Europe on the road to recovery. And I think that's not correct. What a weaker euro would do is, over time, it would help with European exports. But we know that it takes 3 months, 6 months, 9 months before the weaker exchange rate shows up in the form of enhanced export performance. Insofar as the the weaker euro was accompanied by inflation in Europe, there would be no improvement in European export performance, but inflation would help with internal rebalancing, the idea that German costs need to go up relative to Italian and Spanish labor costs. So you can see different scenarios under which a weaker euro might help with one or another of Europe's crises, but I don't see how it helps with all of them. Europe has a banking crisis, a debt crisis, a growth crisis, a rebalancing crisis, and a political crisis. If you have 5 targets, you need 5 instruments, and currency devaluation is only one. Foaming the runway, what would happen most immediately if Greece announced unexpectedly that it was defaulting, it was printing IOUs, it was kind of doing what Argentina did in 2001. I can imagine 3 things would happen immediately. There would be bank runs in Spain, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, and elsewhere in the expectation that other countries could conceivably follow, so the ECB would have to provide banks directly or governments the real resources need to reassure depositors that they would get their money out whole. There would be a liquidity crisis in the banking system. The ECB would have to provide unlimited liquidity to the banks because the interbank market would seize up. And there would be a sovereign debt crisis because with one country defaulting, people would ask who's going to be next. The ECB would have to intervene in the sovereign debt market as well. I think that's what you do in the first week to give the policymakers enough time to fly to Brussels and figure out what a concerted response will involve.
Thank you. Second round, Elga and Roberto and Arno. And then we move on. And on the mic.
Sorry. I'm Helga Hoffman, retired UN economist. I read your article in Financial Times Deutschland, Zins Unsinn, nonsense, Zins nonsense. And there you said that to make the rescue fund and the deposit guarantee fund, the German taxpayer would not be called to do that. I would like you to explain how, because you, en passant, you say that, because that was what Zinn's argument was. And to make you a little bit less pessimistic about the political debate, at least the German parliament approved the agreement of the 29th June.
Roberto Gianetti.
My name is Alberto Gianetti da Fonseca, Federation of Industries of State of São Paulo. Well, exploring alternatives. If I'm not wrong, I read in your book 2 alternatives which were not mentioned here. One is a multilateral multilateral currency basket, like the special draws receipts of International Settlement Bank, and as well flashback for a gold standard, if it's somewhere any possibility on that. Thank you.
Arno. Would you like to make a question, Alisa? No. Yes. Would you mind if he goes first? Alexandre, you have a locational advantage. Go ahead.
Okay. I will explore it. Just want to know what Barry might be thinking about the possibility of a breakup in the euro if, rather than being caused by southern countries being forced to leave, the northern countries themselves leaving, creating a new kind of euro, what kind of dynamics of adjustment would happen if, and this would be a better alternative than the southern countries leaving the single currency.
Great.
Okay. So maybe I'll take the SDR and gold question first because the other two fit together. Indeed, in my book where I argued the most likely constellation for the international monetary and financial system would be a tripolar system organized around the dollar, what I now like to refer to as a European currency, and the renminbi. I did mention in passing two other possibilities because they've been much discussed in the past. Some kind of synthetic international unit like the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights, and gold, or more generally a commodity-backed unit. I'm a skeptic about SDRs, partly because I think the governance problems are like the governance problems that the euro faces, but on a global scale, and therefore even more untractable. So for the SDR to be a meaningful source of liquidity, you need to be able to provide more in a crisis. You need to be able to provide more over a weekend. You need to authorize the International Monetary Fund to act more like a global central bank. And the US Congress has to agree to allow the IMF to act like a global central bank. SDRs are basically baskets made up of dollars and euros and Japanese yen and a few other subsidiary currencies. And when people need SDR liquidity in a crisis, the IMF goes to the US Treasury and says, please give us a few dollars. And the US government decides. You could change that by allowing the IMF to go directly to the Fed and say, give us unlimited amounts of dollars. But that's, again, the US government giving the IMF the ability to act like a global central bank. So my conclusion is that politically, as soon as we have a global government, we'll have a global reserve unit. That's, in a way, the prerequisite. I think any investor and central bank, for that matter, that has a widely diversified portfolio ought to have some commodities or commodity-linked assets in their portfolio. So it's not entirely crazy for central banks to have some gold in their portfolios. But if you think about it that way, why gold and not also silver and copper and uranium and whatever? Back to the euro. I should give some context for the SIN's nonsense article. I didn't pick that title, but I'm not expecting an invitation to Munich anytime soon. The context, for those of you who don't know, is that on June 29th there was at the end of that summit, there was the agreement to create a banking union with two elements, as I described: the common European supervisor for the banks, and number two, the ability of the European Stability Mechanism to directly recapitalize banks. Professor Sin organized a public letter of initially 180 German economists protesting against this, saying that this was the worst engine of moral hazard that the world had ever seen, and that the German taxpayer would be guaranteeing all of the liabilities of the entire euro area banking system. So the latter is technically correct if the banks have no capital, if their assets are worth zero. It's technically correct if Germany is the only country paying into the European Stability Mechanism, of which it owns, what, 27% of the capital? So we've already scaled down Professor Zinn's estimate relative to his own very considerably. In the United States, we have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that can inject money directly into banks, and it tries to intervene relatively early before the banks are totally broke. It goes in on a Friday and seizes the bank and its records, kicks out the management, recapitalizes it, or closes, puts it in custodianship or closes it down. That's how the European system would work as well. The FDIC is not funded by the taxpayer. I think few taxpayer funds may have been used to resolve the savings and loan crisis of the 80s, but not even then. It's funded by fees levied on the banks, fees that could be disproportionately levied on the big banks. Here's another explanation why the German banks don't like the banking union idea so much. But I basically got all upset by this letter and by Professor Zinn's role, because he said, no banking, I don't want my banking union, but I want my euro. He offered no solution to the problem. He fought against banking union, but he didn't offer an alternative. So I saw it as kind of a destructive exercise, unless you explain the other way in which you're going to solve the banking problem, both in the short run and the long run. It's not a consistent argument. Finally, new Northern European euro. So the idea would be that, one idea would be that Germany and Finland and the Netherlands, together with their friends, their few remaining friends, would decide that they were going to go their own way and form a Northern European euro. You would have to imagine that this is consistent with the Treaty of European Union, which it's not, but maybe it could be made consistent somehow. The first thing that would do would be to provoke the mother of all financial crises in Southern Europe. So Germany would be jeopardizing a whole range of European agreements by inflicting immense economic and financial damage on its Southern European neighbors if it did that. So again, I think Europe has gotten to the point where nothing can be ruled out. But the scenario we're describing is one in which Germany inflicts immense damage on Southern Europe. And given the European construction, European history, 20th century German history, I think it would hesitate, think long and hard before moving in that direction.
Arno?
My name is Arno Meyer from Banco do Brasil. I think you more or less answered the question I will make to you. In times of crisis, you see and hear all types of things. And recently, I read an article, I think it was in the Financial Times, who said that it is Germany who should leave the euro and introduce the Deutsche Mark. Not introduce, but use the Deutsche Mark again, because the Deutsche Mark still exists. Okay, and let the Deutsche Mark appreciate and let the euro depreciate. This would stimulate the southern economies and would help to solve their problems. The southern economies will keep the euro like it is, but Germany should leave and use the Deutsche Mark. My question is, if you take proposals like this seriously, after all, it was Germany which was mainly behind and backed the creation of the euro.
Hello, my name is Luis Furlan from Concordia, and with all these unattractive people competing on the beauty pageant and the whole liquidity of the financial markets, and also the countries trying to pick up growth by putting down interest rates, is it reasonable to assume that the capital markets will shift a little bit back to the real economy, such as real estate and investing in the companies, as it would not be paid enough otherwise, and the financial markets have so many clouds in the horizon these days?
Any additional question on the side of the conference room? No? Okay.
Hi, my name is Renan Carreira from Agência Estado. You said that only a Marshall Plan can keep Greece in the Eurozone. Do you think somehow there will be this Marshall Plan?
I have written also for German newspaper reader consumption about how there needs to be a foreign aid program for Greece, foreign aid that's with strings attached, whose disbursement is conditioned on doing things like fixing the German tax system and the like. My assessment at the moment is that antagonism between Germany and Greece has reached such a point that no, it won't happen. And I think that, you know, that's a Greek tragedy that, you know, people ask me what will be the consequences for Greece of a Greek exit. We don't know, because we've never really seen an exit from a monetary union by a country with a well-developed modern financial system. People talk about the breakup of the ruble zone after 1990. Well, none of those countries had financial systems to speak of. Or they talk of the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian monetary union after World War I. Pretty rudimentary financial systems, capital controls all around. So I don't think they're good precedents for what will happen. I see heroic investment bankers suggesting that there would be an additional 20% fall in Greek GDP as a result of an exit. So it would be a tragedy. It would be a disaster, I think. I don't think that the other Europeans have absorb the longer-term consequences that might flow from that for the Greek people and the Greek political system and all that. But I'm not hopeful. So the answer to what would happen if Germany unilaterally reintroduced the Deutschmark and allowed it to appreciate against the rump euro is the same as the Northern European versus Southern European euro question. The only thing I would add to what I said before was that in addition to inflicting large costs on Southern Europe, it could be damaging for Germany itself in the short run. The new Deutschmark would strengthen dramatically against the euro, presumably, and that would hit German exporters as well. Will the financial sector play less of a role in the future than it has in the recent past in countries like my own, the United States? I certainly hope so, where financialization has been a very mixed blessing. But the striking, it is striking in the aftermath of the financial crisis, how that really hasn't happened. There are a bunch of securitization markets that collapsed in the crisis that probably will come back over time. The big banks are even bigger. Compensation practices in the financial services industry haven't been changed dramatically. I'm not confident that the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act of, when was it, 2011, will make a significant difference, because I don't think any piece of legislation that's 2,000 pages long can make a significant difference.
Faldini, just wait for the microphone. Ali, oh.
Hello. My name is Roberto Faldini. I was previous the chairman of the Brazilian Securities Exchange Commission, but nowadays I'm an independent member of several boards in Brazil and abroad. You brought to us really all the history of what happens the first beginning of the last century and so on, and predicting or trying to predict what's going to be in the future. And looking around what happened, we see again and again that mistakes are done or are repeated by the governments because memory is too short. I would like to understand from yourself, knowing all this history, what's prevailing, memory or political pressure to avoid this kind of errors that always we are doing to avoid this crisis and bigger crisis around? Thank you.
That's one.
I think this is
The last one.
presumably the last one.
I think that last question is a very, very good one. My first love is economic history. I do a lot of teaching about financial crises, for example, in the past. Understanding the history, past history, does not give you any special powers about predicting the future. I certainly did not predict the financial crisis through which we've lived in the advanced country world in the last 3 or 4 years. I think history is a set of blinders as well as a lens through which to observe your current situation. So Mr. Bernanke is a student of history and has written widely on the Great Depression. He saw the danger of deflation and responded very aggressively starting in 2007, 2008. He did not see the crisis in the shadow banking system because the earlier episode of which he was a student, the 1930s, there was no shadow banking system to a first approximation. It was a crisis limited to the regular banking system. So he saw certain dangers coming as a student of history, and he missed others as a student of history. When I have taught the Great Depression in the past, and I now force myself to revise those lectures, it was always tempting to teach it. Look how silly these policymakers were in the 1930s for making obvious mistakes, reflecting their limited understanding of the economy, limited appreciation of history. We moderns understand the economy better and have more, are better students of that history. We would never commit similar mistakes, which of course we have in abundance. So what does that mean? I think it means in part what I said before, that history is useful, but it's an imperfect guide for dealing with responding to current problems. And I think it reflects what you referred to, the primacy of politics over economic advice, no matter how sound. I've had this discussion at great length with my colleague Christina Romer. In the first years of the Obama administration, there were famous battles between the economic advisors and the political advisors, and we know who won. And finally, the role of ideology, that ideology informs politics, it informs economic policy making. We economists, many of us, are slaves to our ideologies as well. People are, you know, human beings are pretty ideologically rigid, and that is a problem for responding to unexpected events, and certainly for responding to them in real time. So again, we see all of these things in Europe at the moment. History is a very imperfect guide. We know how the gold standard collapsed, but that tells us only limited things about what a euro collapse would look like. We see in Europe how politics trumps sound economics every time, and we see how ideology is really important for explaining why they respond the way they do.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Eichengreen. I would like you to join me in a warm applause to the Professor Eichengreen.